Be in Esther chapters 7 and 8 today. Unfortunately, some technical difficulties made it where we couldn't record our class session on Wednesday night, and so we're going to do that now. We're going to move pretty rapidly through this. There's really not a whole lot as far as comments to make concerning the narrative. It's just very important that we realize where we've been and where we're going. Thus far, Esther has gone into the king for the first time. She's risked her life. The king, as the Bible says, held out his golden scepter to her. She was welcomed in. He says, honey, what do you need? Whatever you need, as long as it's in my power to do it, I'll do it for you. And Esther almost gets it out, and then something happens. I think that this is a nervous faith. I think that something's going on with Esther where she's almost there, and then she just can't get it. And so she invites the king and Haman back the next day to another banquet, and that's where we're going to pick up in chapter 7. After Haman leaves from the first banquet, he goes home and realizes that Mordecai is not even acknowledging his presence. It's not so much that Mordecai isn't bowing down or paying homage to Haman. It's the fact that he's not acknowledging his presence at all. And then Haman comes back and wants to address the king about killing Mordecai. And the king says, well, who would the king like to honor in the kingdom? What's to be done for the one to whom the king would like to honor? There it is. And Haman thinks to himself, well, who would the king want to honor more than me? And what we find is that the king wanted to honor Mordecai because Mordecai had saved his life. Nothing had been done for it. And in an honor-shame culture, that certainly was shameful. And so the king says, well, what should be done? Haman says, you need to put him in the royal robes. You need to give him the royal stud and parade him through the town and have him dressed by the king's most noble official. And the king says, that sounds really good. Why don't you do that to Mordecai the Jew? And so Haman does that. He goes home. He is just so ashamed. Verse 12 of chapter 6 tells us that his head is covered. And we know from 2 Samuel 15 and Psalm 34 that this covering of the head is a sign of immense shame. And so we come then to chapter 7, leaving chapter 6 with Haman being taken back to the banquet. So chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, going to verse 2. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you, and what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Now, I want you to notice here a few things. First of all, it's the second day. This is the second feast. Perhaps over time, Esther has come to a fulfillment of what she needs to do. Maybe she's got more confidence. Maybe she went back and continued to fast and pray. We just simply don't know. But there's something that's going to happen here. Maybe she just can't wait any longer, and she is going to have to tell the king what the problem is. Also notice that they were drinking wine after the feast. This is after the meal. They're in a private chamber. They're drinking wine. That really shouldn't surprise us because the Persians were known for their drinking bouts. When you go back to chapter 1 and you see the feasting and the banquet and the drinking and all that was going on there, remember that there was a custom where when the king drank, everyone else had to drink. And that may be a custom going on here. Regardless, we do know that alcohol was certainly involved, and as I've suggested in other videos, the king seems to be a character who doesn't really think things through, especially under the influence of alcohol. Notice that he says, up to half my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. This is not to be taken literally. In other words, he's saying, if it's in my power to do this for you, then I'll do it. Now going on to verse 3, then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king, let my life be granted to me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we would have been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have kept silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Wow, the cat's coming out of the bag. Esther now has made known her identity. Everyone knows who she is. She is part of a different people. And remember, when Haman first gave the suggestion of the edict, he never once said that he was going to do it to the Jews. He just said, there's a people who are under your power who don't obey your laws. They have their own set of laws that they obey. Somewhat, I think, of an obscure reference to the law of Moses, though we just can't be sure. Notice that she says, grant me my life for my wish and my people for my request. Well, the king must have been baffled because he doesn't realize that Esther's life or that Esther's kinsmen are part of this edict. And I love what she says here in verse 4, that if we had been sold just as slaves, I'd have kept my mouth shut. The Jews knew what it meant to be slaves. They were slaves in Egypt. They're slaves in the exile. The Jewish story seems to be on opposite sides of the coin, a story of freedom and slavery, freedom and captivity, revolt and peace, good times and bad times, and there never seems to be a balance between the two. If there is one, it's the extreme. If there's another, it's the other extreme. Now notice where verse 4 says, we have been sold. This may be referring to the 10,000 talents of silver that Haman promised the king. And we don't know if Haman was that rich or if he was going to use the plunder off of what he made from the Jews. But regardless, he had the money somehow or was going to get the money. And so that may be what this is referring to. You come down to verse 5 and 6, then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and enemy, the wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Boy, wouldn't you like to have been a fly on the wall? Wouldn't you have liked to seen this go down? And I guess I would like to have been. But there again, maybe this is something that I wouldn't have liked to have seen. I certainly would have hated to have seen Haman in this particular setting, because one thing I've tried to get us to understand is that Haman is a human being. Haman is not just the evil guy. He is not. He's not the Lex Luthor of the Batman world. He is a human being. But notice what Esther says. Boy, she has some strong language here. And go back to verse 4, where she gives the same three synonyms that were in the edict: to be killed, to be annihilated, to be destroyed. Now notice the three descriptions that she's going to use for Haman: a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. Boy, Haman, he didn't realize, I don't think, the severity of what he was doing. And of course, I think that is a lesson to us today, that when we make decisions, we really need to think them through. Even though they may seem like a good decision to us, we really do need to think them through. It seems that when the king says, who is he and where is he who has dared to do this, it is very likely that the king is asking Esther, okay, Esther, you've made your point, now make the direct accusation. Call out the person who has done this. At least that's what I think is going on here. You come down to verse 7, and the king arose from his wrath, from the wine drinking, and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? And the word left the mouth of the king, and they covered Haman's face. Wow, a lot to unpack here, a lot of anger and a lot of movement, a lot of passion going on from all angles, from Haman and from the king and even from Esther. Esther's passion rang true when she declared a foe and enemy this wicked Haman. We know now that the king has been drinking wine. He even got up from his wine drinking and went out to the palace garden. If you're going to compare that with chapters 1 and 2, where the king had been drinking wine and Vashti refuses to come in, and the king makes a very rash decision at the request of his advisors to remove her from the harem, strip her from the title of queen, and put her back in the harem, I should say. Boy, the king just makes rash decisions, it seems, time and time again, especially after wine drinking. But now he's gone off to the palace garden. Some commentators say he's going off so he can be by himself to think, and other commentators suggest that he's going off because he's throwing a little temper tantrum. We really don't know. I like to think that he's going out there to settle down before he comes in and make a decision. Notice that Haman, as the king has left, Haman is falling on the couch where Esther was. Boy, Christian and Jewish commentators have taken a lot of liberty with this. Many Christian commentators suggest that what Haman is doing is Esther has eaten, she's been drinking wine with the king and Haman, and so she's relaxing. She's laying down on the couch, she's relaxing, and Haman is going to grab her feet. He's going to literally try to grab her feet and even kiss her feet as a sign of repentance. Jewish commentators, on the other hand, suggest that what's going on is that Haman is trying to force his sexuality on her or rape her in some way, and that's why the king says, "Will he even assault the queen in my own house?" I think that's taking a little bit of liberty with the text. What I think is happening here is that Haman knows that he's in trouble, and he's going to be begging for his life, as the text says. He's probably grabbing her feet, or maybe even kissing her feet, which would have been really out of conduct for the chief official to do, even to the queen. Notice that when they leave, Haman's face is covered. This is a sign of execution, a sign of shame, and it almost seems like a bookend for the life of Haman, where Haman is ashamed and he covers his face in chapter 6, and then his face is covered again in chapter 7. Now let's look at verses 9 and 10. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. Now notice that a cubit is the point from your elbow to the top of your longest finger. Standard measure was about 10 inches. This is 50 cubits high. Wow, that is certainly a large stake. And remember, I've suggested in other classes that the term gallows and hanged shouldn't be thought of as being hanged by the neck and by a noose, because that was unknown in that world. But rather, we should think of this as an impaling stake. You can look at Persian, Median Persian cave drawings and carvings, and it shows that impalement. This may be what Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verse 23 is referring to. Cursed is every man who dies on a tree or who is hanged on a tree. It may even be the background for Roman crucifixion. The fact is that Haman is going to be impaled on this stake that was made originally for Mordecai. If there was a word to describe the life of Haman, I certainly believe that word would be ironic. Haman, he has a pride problem. He is second in command over all of Persia, and yet he has nothing. He has all these sons, all these riches, a wife who loves him, and yet he has nothing because there's one person causing problems. And so he makes this impaling stake for Mordecai. Ultimately, he's going to be hung on that. Notice in verse 9 that Harbona is one of the eunuchs, and that just seems really odd to me, because a eunuch here in the book of Esther is written in either a very positive light or a very negative light. There are two eunuchs who guard the king's chambers that sought to take his life that Mordecai found out about. There's the eunuch Hegai, who Esther first found favor with as she was in the year of beautification and learning court etiquette and things of that nature. And then there's Harbona, who is named by his name, one of the eunuchs, one of the noblemen probably in attendance, and he just kind of blurts out everything that he's thinking, and that would have been very unlikely in Persian court, but the fact is that he did. Notice that when we come in chapter 7 and 8 to the names and to the dates, boy, I think that really gives us an idea that this is something that was a first-hand experience. And so they hang Haman on those gallows that were prepared for Mordecai, and it says the wrath of the king abated. Now what we're going to find in chapter 8 is that just because the wrath of the king had abated does not mean that the problem has gone away, and Esther knows that. So as we get into chapter 8, chapters 8, 9, and 10 really set up the backdrop for the Feast of Purim. Remember earlier in the book of Esther when Haman went into these Zoroastrian soothsayers and these magicians, and they cast lots, they cast pur. That's where we think the word Purim comes from. The ayim is going to be a plural ending of the word pur in Hebrew. And so it's the feast of casting lots. It's to commemorate the deliverance of the Jews in this particular setting. And I firmly believe that the reason the book of Esther is included in our Bibles rather than being viewed as just another apocryphal work is simply that it gives us a biblical background for the Feast of Purim. So let's begin in chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. Well, it seems at the end of chapter 7 that everything is okay. The wrath of the king has been abated, Haman has been killed, and now when we come to chapter 8, and remember chapter and verse divisions were not original to the text, so we come to chapter 8, and it seems that everything is great, that Mordecai is going to be given the place of honor that Haman once had. Esther is going to be given the estate of of Haman. And if Haman was rich enough to have 10,000 talents, that means all those riches are going to Esther. Esther puts Mordecai in charge of this. Notice that she doesn't give Mordecai the estate. She just places him in charge of it. That is simply because that if Esther had taken a gift and immediately re-gifted it, boy, that's just really insulting. And so she wasn't going to do that. But she puts Mordecai over this estate. The king, verse 2, took off his signet ring. He probably took it from Haman before Haman's death and gives it then to Mordecai. Remember that the king gave the signet ring to Haman in order for him to make the decree. Whoever has the signet ring has the authority of the king. And so now Mordecai has that authority. And then verse 3, Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet. She wept and pleaded. And if you're the king, don't you think something is kind of wrong here? Well, Esther, I've given you everything I know to give you. I've given you the estate. I have taken care of the problem. But Esther says, no, you haven't, because the edict hasn't been changed. Esther knows that the law of the Medes and Persians can't be changed. By the way, the Bible is the only source to tell us that, namely in the book of Daniel. But the law can't be changed. That's going to come up even here. Look at verse 4 and 5. When the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, if it please the king, if I found favor in his sight, if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, to the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. It's unclear whether Esther has gone into the king again unannounced, and I think that's really what's happening here. I think she has lost this nervous faith and now has this confident faith. She's gone in again because the king has to hold out that golden scepter to her, and then she announces herself in this court etiquette, if it pleases the king and it's pleasing in your eyes, and so on and so forth. Now, Esther knows that the law can't be changed, but she's asking for it anyways. This is a very different Esther than what we have seen originally, where she says, I can't. My life will be in danger. I can't do anything. No, she's going to do something. She knows that, if I may use a New Testament example, that to live is Christ and to die is gain. In other words, to live and do for her people is going to be very beneficial. And even if it's not, she has this Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego mentality that even if I die, at least I can say that I did all that I possibly could. Now, there's been a lot said about Haman the Agagite. Agagite may refer to King Agag, who is the king of the Amalekites, who were the enemy of the Jews. We simply don't know. Etymology doesn't tell us, and we don't have a good lineage for Haman, so we don't know. I think this may refer to the region that Haman is from rather than a direct relation to King Agag. So she's asking for the king to rewrite, or not rewrite, but to write a revoke of these commands, which he cannot do. Now look at verse 6 and 7. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? In other words, just because Haman's dead doesn't really solve anything. The edict is still there. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. Look at verse 8. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. Again, the Bible is the only place to tell us that. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan. On the 23rd day, the edict was written according to all that Mordecai had commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps, to the governors, to the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. That was verse 8 and 9. So the king's saying, well, I can't revoke the law, because once the law's in place, it's in place. But I can write another one that makes the first one obsolete. And we know that from history that was a common practice among the Persians, that they would write a law and find it wasn't really a good law. And so they just go back and write something else that made the other one obsolete or not worth doing. And that's exactly what's happening here. Notice that it's the signet ring that gives this decree its authority. And of course, Mordecai has the signet ring. He has the power to do what he will. It's said that they wrote to the satraps, governors, and officials. These are the hierarchical governing authorities. There are only 30 satraps that govern these 127 provinces, and then you get smaller as you go. These officials, your Bible may say princes, they are over the smallest areas, almost like we would think of as a governor. From India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. That reminds us of chapter 1. The same phrase is used to talk about the kingdom of the Persians. Notice where it says, each in his own script and to each people in its own language. That's exactly what happened with the first edict. Now, it's unclear whether or not this was written in Paleo-Hebrew script, or if it was written in Hebrew that was adopted from the Aramaic alphabet. Regardless of what alphabet was used, we know that it was totally understandable by every person in every place. Look at verse 10 through 12. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted carriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud. Boy, there's no mistaking the authority that comes with this particular edict. Saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate. There are 3 synonyms, again, the same that were used in the other edict. Any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on 13th day in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. In other words, Haman's decree had said, on this particular day, we're going to kill, destroy, and annihilate all the Jews, and we're going to plunder them. We're going to kill them all, men, women, children, everybody. And now the king's made another edict. Well, actually, Mordecai wrote it and put the authority of the king on it and has sent it to all these provinces, saying, well, that edict is still in play, but if you do, men, women, and children have the authority and the power from the king to fight back, to defend their goods, to defend their lives. Now, we know that the Jews are very numerous in the Persian Empire, and it seems that this is going to be a good deterrent for those who sought to go in and to kill those Jews. Look at verse 13. A copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples. And the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. Wow, they were prepared for battle. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Your Bible may say Shushan. It's the same place. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white. Your Bible may say purple and white, with a great golden crown and robe of fine linen and purple, And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Now, it's unclear what the colors really are. Is it purple? Is it blue? It doesn't necessarily matter. The fact is that these colors signified royalty. My personal belief is that these are likely the robes that Mordecai was dressed in when he was paraded throughout the town square. Just signs of royalty here. Blue, purple, white, things of that nature. He had this great golden crown, which would not have been the king's crown, and it would have been lesser than the king's crown, but still a symbol of authority and royalty as it is. Now, what we notice from verse 15 is that the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. We need to remember that when the first edict was issued in Susa, there was mass confusion. It's not necessarily that there was wailing and gnashing of teeth, though we do know that Mordecai and other Jews entered into a time of mourning. But here, it seems to be a bookend, an opposite result from two opposite edicts. One edict says that the Jews are going to die, they're going to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated, and there's confusion about that. And then you come to this other edict that says, well, the Jews have the authority to defend their lives and their property. And there is joy. There's shouting and joy, not confusion anymore. As we end chapter 8, let's look at verse 16 and 17. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Again, we see just the joy and happiness that comes from this. It's not that the first one has been done away with. We know that can't happen. It's that it's been made obsolete. And so there's happiness, there's light, gladness, joy, and honor, all these descriptive terms to describe what's going on with the Jews. And then notice that you have this idea of feasting and holiday at the news of this. Remember, at the first edict, there was a time of fasting and mourning. And now with the second edict, there's a time of feasting and gladness. I've written a book on fasting. It's called Should Christians Fast? It's an interesting little book that was developed from a master's thesis that I wrote. I hope you'll check that out if you're interested. Basically, what my conclusion was is that fasting is very beneficial, especially in times of sorrow and mourning, and times where we need to humble ourselves in order to grow closer to God. I think that's what's happening with Esther. In Esther chapter 4, there is no issue of prayer. There's no mention of prayer, and we're told that it's a 3-day total fast. No food, no water, no sleep for 3 days. Here, on the other hand, you don't have fasting, you have feasting. Feasting is part of a celebration. The Feast of Purim is going to be a celebration. And so it's nice to see here at the end that there is a time of celebration after a long narrative of sadness. Notice where it says in verse 17 that many of the country declared themselves Jews for fear the Jews had fallen on them. There are two ways to interpret this passage, and I really don't know which way is correct. I'll tell you what I think. The first way is to say that these Gentiles, these Persians, or whoever was in the land of Susa and surrounding areas became proselytes, and that is that their men were circumcised, they baptized themselves, and they offer sacrifices. I don't think that's what's going on here, because it just doesn't seem that from this decree that people would just ultimately renounce their gods and have nothing to do with them and ultimately come to a belief in Yahweh, the God of the Jews. Also, it doesn't seem possible that they would have offered sacrifice because they had no temple to offer sacrifice in. I think what this is meaning is that the people rallied around the Jews. They supported the Jews. They empathized and like I said, supported the Jewish cause because the Jews now had this might. They had one of their own second in command. One of their own was queen. And so the Jews now are becoming a significant people in the land of Persia. Well, I've enjoyed our study. Look forward to studying with you again next week as we finish up the book of Esther and perhaps even make it into the book of Ruth. God bless you. I hope you have a good day.